Hello, everyone. I think some people will be joining us a little bit later, but that's fine. So briefly, we'll tell you about next month, just so you're aware of it. Of course, you'll get emails later. And that is going to be Ellen Mills is helping me with this. And we're doing the Health Security Act, more kind of an update of what's going on with that. So that will be in December. You will get it will be obviously on Zoom and you will get information about it. So that's number one. Number two, I just want to start with there have been some concerns today about being, I think the word is bombed, Zoom bombed, but I may have the wrong word. At any rate, so we have that control. So if something goes awry, we will hit the security and it will stop this, and then you'll get back on. We can get them off, and we will start again. So we just want everyone to be aware that some people are not as nice as others. So our group today is the Racial Justice Action group, and they are going to introduce themselves. I can't see them, so now I don't know where they are, but they're somewhere on my screen. Oh, I see them. So we have Michael Adams, we have Andrea Determan, we have Erin Green, and they're going to introduce themselves, give you a little bit of information of how they got to establishing this group. And then we're going to see a PowerPoint, and there will be time to ask questions. And you can do that by putting something in the chat box, or if you're really in it, you can or go like this, and we'll try to get a hold of you. Does that all make sense? You know how technical I am about these things. So I think it's all good, and we're going to go ahead. And Michael, I don't know where you went. Oh, there, you're next to me. Okay, you can go after you unmute yourself.
All right. Thanks for inviting us, Carol Ann. And I want to thank the League of Women Voters for having us. My name is Michael Adams, and there are three of us here today representing the Racial Justice Action Advisory Council, or RJAAC for short. And I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation that kind of goes over our organization, the subgroups that we have, how we operate, how we make decisions, and different things like that. But as Carol Ann said, we're going to open with a quick biography about each of us, me, Erin, and Andrea. So I'm 49 years old. I've been involved in the RJAAC pretty much since it started. I think I came in maybe a few weeks after it first started. And I got involved because I've been acutely interested in racial justice issues for a number of years, and for a variety of reasons, one of which, not the least of which, being that I'm Native American, and my mom is one of the last Native Americans who was abducted by the federal government in an effort to educate her into hating Native Americans. So that was a practice which was common in the United States and in Canada, and it was finally made illegal in 1977 with the Native American Child Welfare Act. And as a result of that, that's why I don't live anywhere near my tribe up in Canada. That's how I ended up in New Mexico. And my mom was really traumatized as a child. And for my whole life, I've known that that was part of my family's history. And it has had me be very interested in racial justice and race issues since that point in time. And I just can't contain myself. So I'm going to throw out a quick hello to Rebecca Shankland. Hi. You're one of my favorite people. And I'm going to turn it over to Erin now.
Hi, my name is Erin Green, and I am also a member of the Racial Justice Action Advisory Council with Mike and Andrea. I joined the Racial Justice Action Advisory Council in its infancy because I felt that as a person of color, I had experienced a lot of marginalization in northern New Mexico in Los Alamos and attending the protests that occurred in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. I saw a lot of like genuine interest that had so much potential to be misdirected, and self-education, book clubs, things like that are really important. And there's also a need for real action beyond reading a book and talking about it with friends. So it became really important to me as a biracial woman to become involved in this council and the work that we're doing and the partnerships that we create. My grandmother immigrated here from Zacatecas, and our family is Chichimeca, which is an indigenous tribe to the area in Mexico. My father is Caucasian. So my grandmother immigrated here. My mother was born here. She met my dad. And I've been living in both worlds my whole life. So I was really passionate about sharing that perspective and hoping to just diversify Los Alamos for my little girls who are also biracial. So that's me, and I will hand it off to Andrea. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Andrea Determan, and I was born and raised in Harlem. And when my brother was killed in Vietnam in 1967, my parents moved us to the northeast side of the Bronx. Remember the Jefferson sitcom? My life was a lot like that. So I was raised in New York City, and from the time I started high school, I was always interested and involved in racial, civic, female, whatever causes that came up that was for everyone. I participated. So I go back a while. My parents was voting. My mom died in 98. My mom and dad were always, they never missed an election. They never missed discussing politics with us and what's right and wrong. And I've got a lot of stuff from my mom and dad. So I'm a teacher. I've been teaching for over 30 years. I specialize in middle school, high school, and I taught in the 4th grade level. I had the opportunity to teach on a reservation in Idaho. I taught in rural, urban, and suburban communities. I also was asked to teach migrant students. And that allowed me to get to know people of all diversities and get an opportunity to see how we're all the same. And I continued to teach and educate and fight for that. I met my husband many years ago. He's an engineer at Idaho, and that's how I got here. I was able to speak once or twice at the BLM protests, and I met some folks, some cool, awesome folks that are a part of this organization, and I said I would help and support them in my background of education. So there you have it. I turn it back over to Mike.
All right. So now we have a presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So we are the Racial Justice Action Advisory Council, and that is, I believe, sort of a mouthful, but I do like the acronym RJAAC. I don't know why it sounds cool to me. I like saying I'm a member of the RJAAC, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about this. If I can figure out how to navigate this slideshow, that is. It seems like it's frozen. There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we started, why we started, the fact that we were originally a surge group, and I will talk about what surge means, that we're POC inclusive. POC is people of color. And then we're going to talk about our organization, and we'll talk about the subgroups. So it took a little bit to get our mission statement, and we decided to keep it short and simple. So the RJAAC disrupts systems of racism in Los Alamos and creates opportunities for equity. That's who we are, and that's what we work for. Los Alamos RJAAC, how we started and our history. After the George Floyd suffocation, Los Alamos high school students began organizing Black Lives Matter events in Los Alamos. There were community members who became interested. Several of the RJAAC members, we were attending those BLM rallies in support of our high school students, and we wanted to organize a group that would focus on racial justice. And at some of those first 1 or 2 BLM events, they asked for volunteers. I wasn't actually involved yet. It was really the infancy. I think it was Erin, Tina, and a woman named Megan Green, I believe, and then Tara Height. And they asked for volunteers, and they were going to form a surge group, which is showing up for racial justice. Typically it's a group of Caucasian activists who partner with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC activists, and take actions based on what the BIPOC activists think will be most helpful. Surge Group is a supportive organization which really works to center the voices of the people of color and their activism. So some of the problems and challenges that occurred with having a surge is that there really are not any Black, Indigenous, or people of color activist groups in Los Alamos for surge to partner with. So the whole point of partnering with a group of people of color, activists who are people of color, that becomes impossible if there are no local groups to partner with. And there were numerous people who showed up at the Black Lives Matter events who signed up to help. And so after some discussion, the decision was made to form a group that was inclusive of BIPOC activists, BIPOC again being Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So we got organized, and I think our first meeting was on Zoom, and I think we had about 50 people involved. And we weren't organized. Actually, I'm not going to say we got organized. We did ultimately get organized, but not at the first meeting, not at the second meeting. And then we started thinking about when we should get organized, somewhere around the third meeting. We had 50 people show up, and they were fired up because everyone had just seen George Floyd being suffocated, and this was on the heels of the previous killings that had happened over the previous several years, almost a decade. So after we had these meetings where we talked and talked and talked, we started breaking into little subgroups, sort of the people who were consistently showing up. And we made a decision to organize our group in a non-traditional leadership model. What that means is that we don't operate in a typical hierarchical model. We don't have a president at the top and then vice presidents and people like that. We're not organized that way. We decided that RJAAC would be a consensus-based model. So we're kind of a flat organization. We build consensus for how to proceed. We don't proceed with a simple majority. So if we have 100 members, we don't take a 51-person vote and then make a decision based on that. We keep discussing and exploring the idea until we've reached a consensus that includes the vast majority and ideally everyone can get on board with. And we've agreed holistically on how to proceed. We decided that the RJAAC would not be directive. So we don't tell people what to do. Rather, it's a place to share experiences, resources, and communication. The actions that we take are derived from subgroups where volunteers can plug in and utilize their talents so that they can forward some facet of racial justice that they care about. So we haven't decided as a central group, the central committee, we haven't decided what subgroups will and won't exist. Our volunteers decide what subgroup they're interested in participating in, and if it doesn't exist, they form it, and then they find volunteers. We decided that the subgroups could determine for themselves how they make decisions based on who's in the group and what they're trying to accomplish. We decided that as a group, we would determine which issues we want to focus on, and that we would focus on issues that are identified by BIPOC community members. However, we would choose which identified topics to work on and how we would proceed. So we're not just sitting here, a group of 5 people, deciding what we think intellectually are the important issues that other people of color are facing in the area. We actually have a subgroup, and we'll talk about this a little bit, for BIPOC members of the community. And we talk about issues that are, that we're dealing with. And out of that subgroup, topics bubble up. And as those topics bubble up, we'll bring them to the RJAAC and say, here's some issues that are being talked about in the People of Color Caucus. And people will then jump on board. Ideally, people will jump on board and a subcommittee will form to try and address that issue. The subgroups are largely autonomous, but they cannot affiliate with RJAAC if they engage in things that are controversial for RJAAC members. For example, a subgroup cannot be anti-LANL because several of us on the RJAAC are LANL employees. So that's part of the consensus, is that the subgroups are autonomous, they make their own decisions, they decide how they want to, what their strategy is, how they admit members to their stuff, but they cannot affiliate with us if they're going to take a stand, which is controversial to members in the RJAAC. They can go form their own group and be unaffiliated, but they can't be affiliated with the Racial Justice Action Advisory Council of Los Alamos. So here are the current subgroups that we have. We have a LANL subgroup, we have a Los Alamos Schools subgroup, we have a Los Alamos County subgroup, Facilitation and Organization subgroup, Communications, and a major function of that is a rapid response. We have talked about having a subgroup for the medical center, but we don't actually have one. It's not an active group. We've talked about having a subgroup for protest and event organization, but we've never really gotten that together. So sometimes we've had one event that we'll talk about when we get to that a little bit later. Basically, we organized an event where we gave people an opportunity to write letters, and then we mailed those. And we have talked about having a youth caucus, but we haven't had enough interest in that for it to form. We do have a Black, Indigenous, and People of Color caucus. We've talked about having an allyship or partner caucus, and that's primarily for Caucasian people who want to learn how to be, allies or partners or advocates for people of color in how we try to address racism and in society. And then we have a newly formed environmental justice subgroup. So the LANL subgroup is, it just kind of formed because we had a number of people in our first few meetings who were employees at LANL, and they were discussing the ERGs, which is the employee resource groups. So they meet fairly regularly and they discuss what's going on in their respective ERGs, and they share information with each other. And they report to the RJAAC about what's happening at LANL, especially within the ERGs. And they have discussions about how and then we've discussed with them about the possibility of offering some of similar training to what happens at LANL, how we could make that available in the community. For example, they have an incredible active bystander training that we've been sort of interfacing with them on to try and find out how we might be able to offer that in the broader community. The schools, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andrea here, and that's it.
As indicated, we have about 20 members that are participating, male and females, and they come from different occupations, and their interest is to support schools, teachers, and support the school teachers and students in combating racism. We have been in contact with Ellen Ben Naim and Christine Koblitz. They shared an inventory list of things that Los Alamos Public School is working on to increase racial awareness, but we haven't unpacked that. Kurt Steinhaus wrote a resolution about increasing funding for inclusive and learning environments. It's quite long and extensive, so we're working on that, as well as all of the other members who are working and thinking about different ways in which we can support the schools in combating racial inequities and supporting racial justice. So right now we're still in the flux, we're thinking about different ways. Of course, one of the major issues would be that since all the kids and parents and everyone's home, we were looking at finding ways and curriculums and different ideas and that so that we can be ready for the next school year. So we're still working on it. And there's a great bunch of folks and anybody's welcome to join, and that's where we're at. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you so much. And one thing I'd like to add to that, although it hasn't, I don't think it's percolated into the school subgroup yet, because I just found out in the Native American Parent Advisory Council that the PED, New Mexico PED, is going to roll out a program aimed at decolonizing our school system. And so they're asking for volunteers, and I volunteered to be on the local committee for that. And for anyone who's wondering, so colonization, of course, is the process of outsiders coming to this continent and creating colonies, and along with that, sort of imposing their will, their values, their ideals on the continent and on the inhabitants of that continent. So my mom, for example, was a victim of colonization when she was abducted from her tribe by the government in order to be taught how to be assimilated into white culture and white society. And her family was a victim of colonization because they lost their daughter. My grandfather spent 15 years and more than $30,000 trying to find his daughter who had been stolen from him. He hired lawyers and private investigators and just lived with heartbreak for, years. And when my mom finally found her way back to the reservation, she didn't get to meet him because she didn't have those records knowing exactly who she was related to. But he found out about her coming back to the reservation. He called her, and he was on the phone with her sobbing for a long time about how hard he had looked for her, how much money he and the tribe had put into hiring lawyers and private investigators. Every summer, he and my mom's sisters would come down to the States looking for her and different things like that. So that's kind of how that went. Next topic. The county subgroup. So the Los Alamos County RJAAC has a county subgroup, and we submitted a petition to Los Alamos County Council on September of 2020, where we requested the following bullet points. We said, because research shows that all people have implicit racial bias, we ask that Los Alamos County implement an annual mandated standalone training, which is separate and apart from the existing harassment training. I was a county employee for almost 12 years, and they have a pretty good biannual harassment training where they teach you about what harassment is and how to avoid being on the wrong side of harassing people. And we want this to be a standalone and separate from that rather than just incorporating it in. This training addresses two goals. First, employees and elected officials will recognize how to identify their own implicit biases. And second, attendees will rethink how to create objective systems that minimize the impact of implicit bias in decisions. And for anyone who's wondering, implicit bias is essentially the biases that we as human beings bring to our interactions that we're not aware we bring. And everyone has them. Oops, somehow I'll address that in a bit. My video shut down. But we all have implicit biases. We have race-based implicit biases. We have class-based implicit biases. We have gender-based implicit biases. And they're basically biases that we just don't know we have. We're not aware of them. They're like the air we breathe, and they're just the realm inside of which we understand reality. And so the training would be aimed at helping people identify what kind of implicit biases they have. And then also, studies have shown, and when I say that all people have implicit biases, that's not just my opinion. That is a fact which has been exposed by many years of study, including online. You can look up the implicit bias test. It was put out by Harvard and by other universities, and you can take a test and it'll kind of tell you what some of your implicit biases are. So the idea is that we want to train people to identify their own implicit biases, but even then, studies show that that has a limited effect. So we also want to help the county understand how they can create structures inside of the county governance and how the county deals with employees and with the public, which take implicit bias out of the question and turn it into a subjective or an objective criterion. So for example, and they actually do a decent job with some aspects of that in terms of hiring. So if you're hired, if you go through a application at the county, all the applicants are asked the exact same questions. They get the exact same criterion for their interviews, and then they're rated on a scale of 0 to whatever on each question. And then the person with the highest score is the person who gets offered the job. So it's things like that where we sort of take the subjectiveness out of it. Evan Rose asked, what is decolonizing the schools? So I think that when I was talking about what colonization is, it would essentially be looking at the schools and where and how the schools are organized around values and ideas that are based on colonization. So the primary area that comes to my mind first and foremost is in our history classes, because we teach a version of history which is largely fictional. I mean, not every aspect of history is fictional, but when we're talking about the U.S. history that gets taught with regards to Native Americans, it's largely fictional. We talk about, how great things were at the first Thanksgiving, but we leave out the fact that 5 years later, those same pilgrims or their offspring were slaughtering those same Indians in order to steal their land. 15 years later, that was happening. We leave out a lot of the facts that, we kind of romanticize everything in terms of painting a rosy picture of how the colonists were on the right side of everything, when in fact they weren't on the right side of everything. Maybe they were on the right side of a lot of things with regards to England, but in terms of their history with Native Americans, their history with African Americans, our country has kind of a pretty sad history that a lot of people aren't aware of. In fact, in much of my life, for example, many people were under the misimpression that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. And if you look at the original articles of secession, it is evident and not even controversial that every single state which seceded from the Union listed as one of their reasons for secession slavery and the failure of the northern states to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. And so there's just a variety of aspects of history which we ignore or leave out or don't teach people, which don't reflect well upon us. And that's what colonization is. Decolonization would be offering an accurate history and offering people an opportunity to understand what our history is, so that we could start to have discussions about how to correct the historical injustices and the ongoing inequity that results from those injustices. Because we're not talking about a situation where the slaves were freed in the 1800s and how come everything is still inequitable? Because even after that, we had another 100 years of Jim Crow. Native Americans weren't granted citizenship until 1924, and Native Americans and Black people really were not permitted to vote until the 1960s. And Native Americans, Black people, and Hispanic people, or Latinas, Latinas, were prevented from owning property in the suburbs until the 1960s. And that was official government policy. It was written into the FHA's they wrote it into the deeds when they backed the government-backed loans for homes. So the suburbs are largely Caucasian because of federal government policy for most of the 20th century. And so that's what decolonizing, that's one aspect of decolonization. And beyond that, Evan, I can't answer too much because that's what the committee is going to be about. We're going to explore that and what to do. I'm gonna move on because I'm using up a bunch of time quickly. We'd like for the council to create a county board or committee composed of concerned citizens aimed at identifying and proposing actions for how the county can address racial injustices. This board should meet regularly, be open and transparent, and suggestions should be given significant weight by council in decisions. We'd like council as a body to actively engage in learning more about racial injustice and how it operates in our culture. We would like the council to actively examine where the county has influence or control that could be leveraged to impact racial injustice. And we ask that the council enact measures aimed at improving racial equity. These measures should be quantifiable. The means by which actions are taken could include the SMART performance management tool in order to measure the success of those defined targets. For example, the council could start by asking questions like, why is the majority of the county's executive leadership composed of Caucasian men? In the spirit of igniting inclusivity, we ask the council to officially condemn the killing of George Floyd, along with other ongoing police killings of Black and brown people in our state and country. We ask that the council call for national change on how police interact with people of color. We also ask the council to adopt a public declaration that Black Lives Matter and commit to anti-racism work as the schools have done. So we presented that to county council, they voted on it, and they voted in favor of that unanimously. They guaranteed funds towards those subcommittees, and we're going to begin meeting with the county councilor who's in charge of that this week, I believe. The Facilitation and Organization Subcommittee, and I'm going to ask Erin to talk about.
Hello again. Yes, so the Facilitation and Organization Subcommittee formed in response to many people expressing that they're very interested in RJAAC, but we're apprehensive because it seems to lack organization or structure, which we understand is what many people are used to when it comes to volunteer committees, boards of directors, traditional top-down models that have one person at the top and then maybe two people underneath them and three people underneath them and so on, are largely comforting for most people. This is what we're used to. This is what we rely on, what we believe is what makes our society run smoothly. So in response to hearing hesitation from community members to commit to doing the work with RJAAC because of lacking that type of structure, we formed the Facilitation and Organization Subcommittee. This is the committee that explored different non-traditional models of leadership, that did research on implementation, that followed businesses, successful businesses, that use these different models such as the holacracy, the flat structure that Mike referenced earlier, and circular structure. So once we began meeting and came to a consensus that to submit to the larger group, we were able to decide that in order to elevate BIPOC voices, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and BIPOC issues, we needed to commit to a non-traditional, non-Western organizational structure. And the Facilitation Organization Committee also makes decisions about how the meetings are facilitated. And these are, again, not unanimous decisions. This committee is more of a steering group where we say, okay, we have the time and the energy to submit for discussion that this is an option. This is a proposal. And so we help guide how the meetings are facilitated, how they're organized. The mission statement, we came together to help develop the mission statement as a smaller group and then share it with the larger group. That way everyone's input is valued and examined, but it's not disorganized. We also, after adopting a mission statement, moved forward on a vision statement, because there is so much that we want to include about the organization and about the values that are important to us, that it just couldn't be summed up in a sentence or two, as is appropriate for a mission statement. So we also helped facilitate the development of a vision statement. So essentially, while the title facilitation and organization may convey some type of leadership, it's really steering. It's really whoever's available, who has the emotional energy and physical energy after working all day and being with their kids to say, hey, these are some good ideas about how we can not burn out, how we can support each other. And it's very fluid. So if I'm available for 3 months and able to give a lot, I do that. And if I need to step back from facilitation organization, I'm able to do that in a positive way and let other members know that I would like support, and then someone else is able to give. So that is essentially all the important things, I think. Mike, do you have anything to add about our facilitation organization?
I think you did a great job. I think you pretty well covered it. Thank you, Erin. And next slide, communication. I am on the communication subgroup, and we address communications from the RJAAC to the community. We also have ideas floating around about monthly articles related to Black, Indigenous, people of color in the community. We haven't actually put out an article yet, although we've had one interview, and that's my bad. I did the interview and I just haven't had time to sit down and pen an article yet. But we also set up a rapid response subgroup. So one of the topics that came up in our earlier meetings is that there was a guy, and I cannot remember his name to save my life, who was writing incendiary letters to the editor and basically misrepresenting facts or just making up facts outright related to basically the talking points that racism is make-believe, that there's no such thing, that people who are working on anti-racism are actually racist, and so on and so forth. And Stephanie Knackley and her family wrote a response to him, but then she brought that to the RJAAC, and we tried to pen a response to his letter, and it took us 2.5 weeks to get enough people and everyone. You know, when you send a letter out to 50 people and ask them what they think, it can take it 2.5 weeks is a really fast turnaround when you do that. So what we decided was that for a rapid response, we didn't want to have a 2 or 3 week turnaround in responding to a letter to the editor or something else. So we decided that we were going to form a small group of people, some of whom would be editors and spell checkers, and anyone could write a letter. But basically, you would write the letter, you would submit it to the communication subgroup. It would be reviewed by 2 editors, and they would do spelling and grammar corrections. And then the letter would be forwarded to the whole RJAAC email list. And people would have the opportunity either to sign their name to it or not. There was no more, can you change this word to that and rewrite this sentence that way and stuff like that. It was either you can sign your name to it or not. And if we got 2/3 of the people who were involved in the RJAAC, if 2/3 of the people signed their name, then we would submit that letter to the editor from the RJAAC. Otherwise, it would be submitted. It could be submitted from the people who signed their names, but not from the committee. And that was sort of how we got around that, trying to be able to have a rapid response at the same time as having some kind of substantial unanimity on our messaging. And then there's the BIPOC caucus, the Black, Indigenous, and People of Color caucus. It's composed of BIPOC community members who may or may not be in the Racial Justice Action Advisory Council. The caucus is led by Kokyong McNaughton, and this is where issues might be exposed for the RJAAC to focus on. The space is for BIPOC people only, and it's to share experiences about being minorities in a majority white community. So we have a number of people. We have some Native Americans, we have some Asian people, and by Asian, I'm taking a broad swath. We have all of Asia. I can't go through the whole list right now because it's not coming to my head. But I don't just mean people from China and Vietnam or in Japan. It includes people from India and other parts of Asia. We have, it's just representative of people in the community, and we talk about things that we experience. You know, for example, I heard of someone. This wasn't in the BIPOC, but I did hear of an individual who, at work, was working with people, and one of this individual's coworkers started making Chinese noises at them, and thought it was just hilarious, and different things like that. So we talk about those things, and if something becomes evident that it's a real community problem, then it's something that one of us will bring back to the RJAAC and say, hey, this keeps coming up in the BIPOC caucus, maybe we should address it. Then we have the environmental justice subgroup, and this is a brand new subgroup. We're literally in the process of organizing the group. Primarily what we're doing right now is providing information to members about environmental issues in the area. We're educating members of the subgroup about the technical details of environmental issues and impacts, as well as which legislative bodies, rules, and laws are applicable to anyone who wants to take action about those. We will make decisions about which issues we want to advocate for as a group, but we're going to wait until after we become informed on local issues. This subgroup is committed to making connections with the appropriate contacts to maintain environmental stewardship in and around Los Alamos. We recognize that environmental issues affect everyone. However, they usually have a disproportionate effect on minority communities, and we will support minority communities in having those issues addressed. So a lot of what we've been doing is we've had Megan Green, who works for the state and has a lot of expertise about different environmental issues related mostly to LANL and 3B. So she's been giving us, along with Mike McNaughton and some other people who really have a deep level of expertise, they've been teaching us about the technical details, why the NNSA or the DOE says this level of tritium is safe and this level isn't, why, different things like that. And we're trying to really educate ourselves and develop some real technical expertise in these arenas so that we can decide what issues we want to advocate for based on sound science and based on what we think is going to make the greatest impact for the surrounding BIPOC communities, the local pueblos and different things like that. And then the other thing we're doing is that we're really reaching out to people because we don't, for example, we don't want to go make an appointment with the director of LANL, Tom Mason, and then sit down and get on his case about something that he has no control over. If who we really need to talk to is our congressional representative, we want to know that that's who we need to talk to. Or if we really need to reach out to someone at the NNSA, we want to know who that is and how we should reach out to them. So we want to make sure that we're in this environmental justice subgroup, that we're reaching out to the appropriate people who can actually make a difference, and that we're reaching out with facts based in sound science. And Erin, do you have anything to add to that?
Everything that you said, and also just being aware of the environmental impact, and sharing that, you know, not just with leaders in our community, but also making the information accessible to everyday people in Los Alamos, and sharing how they can help, even if they're not a part of RJAAC, make a difference in awareness and practices, environmental stewardship, and sharing that with everyone in their circles as well.
Thank you. So finally, how can you get involved? It is not necessary to be a member of the RJAAC. As Erin said, we meet, I think we're meeting once a month now, and we talk about everything that's happening in the different subcommittees. And then we maybe talk about something that came up in the BIPOC caucus or things like that. And we sort of make decisions about what we would like to see the RJAAC form a subcommittee to address. So it's sort of an administrative function, and that doesn't really light everyone's fire. So maybe you don't even want to be a member of the RJAAC. Maybe you want to get involved in environmental justice. Or maybe you're a person of color and you want to be a participant in the BIPOC caucus, or any number of things like that. You can reach out to any one of these contacts. You can email us at racialjusticelosalamos@gmail.com. You can go to our Facebook page, and there's a link for how to contact us, or Instagram. And you can let us know what you're interested in participating in, and we'll put you in contact with that subgroup. And if you want to be on the RJAAC, then we're going to ask you to get involved in one of the subgroups and spend a little time being involved with the subgroup, and then we can consider you for, you know, membership in the RJAAC. But we really want people in the RJAAC to have some familiarity with the subgroups and what kind of work we're doing, and understanding that we're not a traditional top-down hierarchical organization. There's no power in the RJAAC. It's not like you've gotten to the RJAAC and now you're at the pinnacle of power in the Racial Justice Action Advisory Council. The power really lies in the subgroups. That's where stuff gets done. That's where the difference gets made and stuff gets done, and where the real decisions get made. And I think that just about sums it up. So we now have time for questions. And I'm going to go back to the list of subcommittees so that anyone who might be interested in getting involved can look at those and determine if you want to reach out to us at racialjusticelosalamos@gmail.com. So I think there's a raise your hand function, or you can wave your hand around and hopefully we'll see it on the screen, or send a note, a chat, which is going to the host if you have any questions.
So it's uncharacteristically quiet here.
So
Let me say that. So, you know, I don't do this computer stuff, people. So if you want to talk, maybe we should, if we take this screen share off, Michael, then can you see people and they could just raise their hands or not?
maybe, let's try it.
I think Elizabeth Auden, wherever Elizabeth Auden is on here. Do you see her hand, or? Oh, there she is up here. Do you see her, Michael?
Yeah, I see
Unmute
her.
her. Yeah, unmute her.
I'm
Second.
looking.
There, whoops. Her hand is up and I
Okay.
cannot unmute her.
You just
Michael, can you?
Got it. She's on mute.
There we go.
Okay, she's ready.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Elizabeth.
We can.
Oh, great. I just wanted to say thank you for an excellent talk. And I work at Lennell and I've attended the active bystander training and I thought it was great. If there's anything I can do to help facilitate, please let me know. And I learned about the training through the Atomic Women group and I'd be happy to talk to them about it and see if there's anything I can do. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Your favorite teacher, Michael.
Yeah, we have a question from, or a comment from Rebecca Shanklin. Or did she raising her hand, did you say?
Yes.
Oh,
unmute
go
her.
ahead and unmute her.
I don't know how
Let me
to.
see if I can find her.
There we go. I did it.
Got it. Go
There we
ahead.
go.
I did it. Okay.
Yay.
So I actually wrote this question on chat. So somebody needs to be monitoring the chat, but I don't know who that would be. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I am so impressed. I'm so glad we had this chance to hear from you all. I am so impressed with your structure and your emphasis on consensus and education, which is exactly what the League of Women Voters do. It's all done by consensus, but before consensus, you have to educate people on what the issues are. So that's terrific because too many times in our lives, we see people getting what they want or trying to get it through unpleasant, violent action or shouting and screaming. So this is really the way to go. Anyway, I think what most of us would really like to hear is stories and the history. Mike, you've done a really good job of educating yourself. So the rest of us need that same sort of education because you know what? We are these white people who actually do not know what's going on. Black Lives Matter, all this police violence, we just didn't know about it. It was hidden from us. So what I am hoping you'll do is get those stories out. I really encourage you to write letters to, I was going to say the Monitor, but it's now the Reporter and the Daily Post. But people do read those things. So bravo, keep it up and educate us. Thanks.
I'd like to address that a little bit, actually. For anyone who is furiously interested in taking notes, I'll do this a little bit slowly, but I have a reading list. So if you want to learn some of the history about what I'm talking about, and these books are available on Audible as well. So while you're driving, or often I listen to these books while I'm cooking or cleaning the kitchen. Some of the books I would recommend, one of them is called The Other Slavery, and it talks about the enslavement of Native Americans in the Southwest. And there were some pretty surprising facts that I learned out of that. For example, chattel slavery in the South was significantly modified after people traveled west and learned how slave markets that the Spanish had set up for Native Americans operated. And they took what they learned back to the South and really utilized that in how they set up slave markets in the South. And the other thing that surprised me was that a lot of the Native American slaves who were taken in the Southwest, I might add illegally, because it wasn't legal in Spain to take Native Americans as slaves. So they found different ways around that, to call them indentured servants for 50 years and things like that. But they ended up being sold to people in the Midwest. So there were Native American slaves owned by English settlers as far out as Indiana, Ohio, all over the place. And I didn't know that until I read that book. And another really great book is An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And it really talks about, it covers the fact that every single treaty that the U.S. government has ever signed with any indigenous nation ever has been broken by the U.S. government. They have broken literally every single treaty they ever signed with any indigenous nation ever in our history. So that, and it talks about some of that in details. It also gives a great history of the Pan American indigenous movement, starting with the occupation of Alcatraz Island and the standoff at Wounded Knee. And then some other authors that I read, that I've been reading a lot. One of my favorites is Bell Hooks, who is a prominent feminist, a Black feminist, who became well known in the 80s. And she wrote a book called Ain't I a Woman, which was taken from the title of a famous speech about 100 years earlier. And then she also wrote another book called Feminism is for Everybody. And that's a play on words, of course, because feminism is for everybody, but it also says feminism is for everybody. And she just does an incredible job of talking about both feminist ideas as well as how they intersect with racism and racial identity. And I found it to be an incredible book. And then a book that I'm working on right now is an introduction to critical race theory, because I realized after some of the comments that I had seen that a lot of people are really opposed to critical race theory. And I was fairly certain in reading their comments that they don't know anything about critical race theory, because of the things they were saying just didn't sound like what I was hearing from the activists that I follow. But I realized I didn't really know what critical race theory is. So I decided I better get a book. So I've been listening to that book, and it's fascinating. Critical race theory really grows out of legal academia. It is entirely based in legal structures. And then it was taken and applied in other arenas after that. So it's not what people think it is, mostly people who are opposed to any kind of anti-racism. It's not what they think it is. It's entirely based out of legal structure and a legal understanding, and it's just I highly recommend that book. So, and then I'll take your word, your advice, Rebecca, and maybe we can start publishing some articles or putting some stuff out about, what happened here, what happened there, some stories.
And I'm sure we can get that book list into our newsletter, so people will remember those names. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Barbara Califf says, this was a great talk. Please explain the ERGs at Lanel. So an ERG is short for an employee resource group. And I'm sort of semi-involved, personally, I'm semi-involved with the Native American Resource Group. And basically, it's a group of people. We meet mostly on our lunch breaks, and we talk about, so I meet with other Native Americans, and then we talk about sort of what may be going on. Or this month, we took the lead in planning Native American Heritage Month activities at Lanel. We put together a panel discussion, which included Native Americans who also have Hispanic heritage, so that they could talk about sort of the intersection of being Native American and being Hispanic, because a lot of people in New Mexico fail to understand that those are completely distinct. They're not the same. I mean, we look similar because we all have, brown skin that's not all the way to black, but very distinct cultures. Latino, Latina, Hispanic culture really kind of is an outgrowth of Hispanic culture, which was a colonizing culture. They enslaved us. They cut off our feet. They did some pretty terrible things to Native Americans, and they are the power structure in New Mexico even to this day. And what I don't mean by that is Latino or Latina immigrants. They're not part of the power structure in New Mexico. It's what we refer to as norteños. So it's people who are Hispanic, who are from northern New Mexico, and their ancestors are from northern New Mexico. That's the power structure. There's a lot of poverty, don't get me wrong, but it is the power. It's hard to get elected to many positions in the state if you don't have a Hispanic last name and different things like that. So there's that. And then completely distinct from that, there is the Native American population, and it's not a monolith. So there are numerous pueblos, and they're all part of the Tewa people, but each pueblo is distinct. It has many of them have a distinct language. They have their distinct governance, and they sort of collaborate. But then we also have an Apache reservation. We have Navajo. This is traditional Comanche land. And there's a number of tribes that kind of operated in and around New Mexico, northern New Mexico, southern New Mexico. And Native Americans collectively make up about 13% of the population. So we're a clear minority in the state. We're not part of the power structure. And we have some of the highest rates of poverty. And I'm talking we because I identify as Native American. I am not a Native American from New Mexico. My mom was kidnapped from Canada when she was actually kidnapped from Washington State when her mom had her here. But my tribe is from Canada. I am not a local Native American. I'm what we refer to as a dislocated Native American. So I grew up here because my mom was kidnapped, and then she was adopted into a white family, and they settled in New Mexico. And so I grew up kind of racially isolated. I was not part of the Hispanic culture. I was not part of any of the local indigenous cultures. I was clearly not white growing up. I was on a daily basis in 7th and 8th grade. I was racially harassed and called various racial names, and physically assaulted and bullied on almost a daily basis. And that's sort of my history. So I'll shut up now. There's another question.
We have time for maybe one, maybe two, depending on how long that question and answer will be. It's a little bit after 1. So does anyone have a question? I think you can do that. This is what happens, Michael, when you present such a complete and comprehensive speech and showed us all these slides. We got our answers. Is there anybody else before we thank them? Erin?
I would just like to kind of a delayed answer or statement in response to the request for sharing stories and articles, and just to re-emphasize that the work of RJAAC is not to expect our BIPOC members to exchange stories for care. Our stories are often traumatic and have taken our entire lifetime to unpack and understand and to feel secure and safe in our own skin and in our own communities. So while stories are necessary and can create bridges between people, it is important that our white members do the work of creating and sharing those stories, that our white members reach out to our BIPOC members and say, how can I interview you? How can I share your story? Because Black, Indigenous, people of color are exhausted. And we need allies who are going to be proactive and committed. So stories are valuable, so valuable, but they're not bargaining chips. That's it.
Christina? Can you unmute? I think you're unmuted, Christina.
Me now?
I think so.
So I would like to add to Mike's answer to Barbara about what are the ERGs at LANL, and really encourage people, if they are not familiar with them and they do work at the lab, to get involved. And that does kind of dovetail onto what Erin just said. Is so the ERGs are the government mandated employee resource groups that cover all the minorities. So it's the racial minorities, African American, Hispanic, East Asian, American Indian, also people with disabilities, and the LGBTQ group and the women's groups. And also Active Bystander has become an employee resource group. I'm involved in those too. So people can ask me questions if you have any of the LGBTQ or the Active Bystander group questions, but they're great resources to find community within a huge workplace where it's hard to find your people. And then we really do sort of have the ear of some of the leadership right now, which is fantastic. We each have a champion on the leadership level. For example, the LGBTQ group has Kelly Beyerschmidt. The African American group has Francis Chadwick. So those are some of the big hitters at the lab. They are listening. We don't have a lot of power, but we are in contact and we do meet, and we are working all together as a cohesive body with all the ERGs together too, which is kind of awesome. So if people aren't familiar with any of those, we highly recommend to check us out. People who work at the lab have never heard of us, unfortunately, and we're constantly trying to get the word out. Things are weird right now with the diversity and inclusion pause that came from the administrative executive order, which we're hoping will go away quickly with the new administration. But right now things are a little strange. And then related to this group, to the RJAAC, which I didn't know that's what you called it, but I love it, Mike, is partnering with the community. And so as much as we can leverage what LANL does or the speakers that we bring in, since we are really so much overlap with LANL employees in the community, to try to just use those same resources to share speakers that come in, whatever initiatives people are working on. I know nobody has a lot of energy to put toward anything, but as much as we can kind of collaborate, that's useful. So if anybody has any questions about any of the ERG stuff, you can definitely reach out to me. Thanks.
So is there anyone else who has a question that just needs to be answered? If not, because I don't see anyone, I will thank our three presenters for educating us and for sharing your stories with us. So, you know, a lot of you are not showing. See, I'm showing, it's okay, but we can give it a clap. And thank you all so much, and we'll see you next month.
Yes, thanks for everyone attending.
Thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. That's the biggest part. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.